it this far into this DVD, chances are you're already fully addicted to spey casting. As you become a better caster, don't lose focus on why you started spey casting in the first place. Our ultimate goal is to make you a better angler. Keep in mind that your casting should be done with the goal of fishing the water in front of you well. In other words, just because you can uncork 100 footers doesn't mean that you'll catch more fish, especially if the pool in front of you only requires a 50-foot cast. In my mind, the best anglers can adjust their cast to the fishing conditions and their tackle requirements. Don't be afraid to unleash it when you need it. Just don't miss the fish that are right at your feet. So now that you've learned how to huck with two-handed rods, we're going to talk about how to fish short with them. You know, on summer rivers especially, riffle water like this kicks out an awful lot of fish. And so many people learn how to cast these things 60, 70, 80, 90 feet, and they never learn how to cast 6. So when you start in a piece of riffle water like this, the first thing you're going to do is just get your fly wet. Make sure your fly is nice and saturated. You know, rabbit and marabou, it holds a lot of air. Just soak it, get all the air out of it, so as soon as you start casting and fishing, your fly is going to start digging. So when you start really short, and I see this all the time, I tell a client, hey, I want you to start really short in this riffle. They oftentimes just use one hand on the rod and try to flop it out there, and oftentimes the fly doesn't turn over. They don't believe me that you can catch fish that short. So what we're going to do is use both hands on the rod, and we're going to do a little aerialized cast. The big thing here is my fly turns over. That's the most important thing, and it turns over clean. In other words, it comes tight. So as soon as I mend it, it starts fishing. As you work out line every 3 or 4 feet, you're going to come to a point where you can start doing spey casts. I've got about half my Skagit head out here. And just remember, when you've got a short line like this, number one, all of your motions are just slower and smaller. And then number two, when you make your cast, you just use the tip of the rod to cast. In other words, a really short casting stroke, just kind of flick the tip. You can use a lot of top hand with that stroke. But again, just remember, we just want the fly to turn over. The next time you're in a piece of riffle water, make sure you fish it clean. Make sure you pay attention to your fly, and you'll do well. If you like fishing big rivers, wind is a reality you're going to have to deal with. There's a few things to consider on those super windy days. We've already talked about how to create more line speed by using more overhang and setting the anchor closer to you. Both of those tips will help tremendously. The wind makes us rush our cast. The biggest mistake you can make in the wind is just simply starting your D-loop too fast. The result is a failure to direct the energy of the D-loop into the 180-degree plane. Instead, start your sweep extremely slow and really focus on the power application. Drive that D-loop back into the 180-degree plane. It also helps to think about driving your forward cast just a little bit lower than you normally would. This will give the wind less of a chance to affect your cast as it goes outbound. Just remember, our goal is to get the fly to turn over. Finally, just cast a little bit shorter. Just remember, a short controlled cast will always catch more fish than a long sloppy cast. I'm in one of my favorite spots to fish in the early morning. It's a beautiful little tail out. Fish always cycle through this little spot. It's just a natural fish trap. So before I fish any spot, I really think about, how am I going to set my cast up? Obviously the wind is going to dictate which shoulder I'm going to cast off of. But the other thing I always think about is, the back casting issues. So for the most part, when we're fishing a dry line, you're going to be making a cast more down and across, like a 45-degree angle maybe on average. And that will change depending on the presentation. But you certainly cast more downstream with a dry line than you would with a sink tip, where you cast more upstream. So the first thing I'm going to think about is, just where my anchor is going to land. On this spot in particular, it really likes a downstream angle, so I'm really trying to set my anchor really close to me so I can get that 180-degree plane going like this. If I set my anchor too high, I'm going to get a bloody L and the cast isn't going to work right. The second thing I think about is my D-loop trajectory. And this is so important when you're casting downstream. It's really easy if you're in a spot on river left, maybe to do a snap T and cast off your right shoulder, it's really easy to get my D-loop in this plane. Well, let's say we're in a situation where the wind is blowing downstream. Now I'm going to have to cast off my downstream shoulder, so I'd be doing a double Spey here. I have to really think about where my D-loop is going. The tendency for people a lot of times as they come around is to rush that acceleration and not get the D-loop going back into the 180-degree plane. So you really want to think about, with dry lines, sort of delaying that power into the D-loop to the last second and then really compressing that D-loop back so you can get that nice angle downstream. That's tough when you're in tight casting conditions, but it's mandatory to make a good cast. When I'm making a presentation with a dry line, I'm really thinking about two things: the speed of the fly and the tension on the fly. So let's talk about speed first. Your speed is going to be dictated really by, first and foremost, your casting angle. If you cast more downstream, that's obviously going to give you a slower swing as it comes across, as if I bring it up a little bit. So right away, my first decision is, what's my casting angle going to be? My second decision is, am I going to mend? And I think mending is kind of misunderstood in dry line fishing. A lot of times people tend to try to make these big trout mends. Really, with these shooting heads, all you've got to do is just set the line in place and get the fly fishing. Once you've made your mend, and a lot of times I don't have to mend, I should say that too. There's times where, if you've got a nice even flow, or maybe it's a little faster out beyond, you can just make the cast, lift your rod tip. The important thing to think about here is, when the fly hits the water and you bring it under tension, that moment where the fly comes under tension is a magical thing. Steelheads see that. It's a catalyst to make them jump on it. So if you kind of imagine you're a fly, it lands, it dead drifts for a few seconds, you lift your rod, you come tight, the fly starts to swing. That moment right there is oftentimes where a steelhead will make the decision whether to eat a fly or to chase the fly. So once I've made my cast and I've set up my swing, I'm really thinking about my goal of swinging a wet fly. And I really try to, number one, base my swing speed on the water temperatures. So in warmer water, I'm going to swing the fly a little faster. In colder water, I want it to swing a little slower. But the more important thing in my mind too is thinking about just a nice consistent swing speed as it comes across. We don't want the fly wagging as it comes across, speeding up and slowing down. So you've got a number of tools at your disposal to accomplish this goal. And a lot of it is kind of what the attitude of the rod tip does. And by that I mean, if you think about, if you make a cast and you just hold your rod tip straight out over the water, the fly is going to swing around off of that one given point. So with that said, I can get tension on the fly by taking the rod over the water. But at some point, I want to start relieving that tension. So I'm going to start following it with my tip, and ultimately, I'll put the fly into a lead. By that I mean I'm bringing the rod towards the shore to the inside of the fly line. Leading actually takes tension off of the fly. So as my fly is swinging, I'm really watching my line. If I start to see it do this, that's telling me I just don't have enough tension on the line. So I can just make a soft little lift, drop it into my lead. Just remember the goal. You're always trying to get the fly, once it starts to swing, to come across on one seductive, smooth swing. So with dry line fishing, we talked about two elements as far as your presentation is concerned. Number one was the speed of the fly. Number two was the tension on the fly. When you sink tip fish, both of those elements are at play as well. And everything we talked about with the floating line presentation also goes into effect with sink tips. The third element in sink tip fishing, though, is depth. And one of the big mistakes I see with a lot of people fishing two-handed rods is just simply not mending properly. And by that I mean, they're not getting their fly down deep enough, especially in the middle of the winter when it's cold. The fish are, really inactive. You've got to get the fly fairly deep. But even in summertime conditions, like today we've got bright sun and the fish have been a little hesitant to come up. Got to get the fly a little bit deeper. So the proper way to make a mend with a two-handed rod is actually using your bottom hand. So I always think about, when I make the cast, I think about drawing an upside down L with my rod tip. So I'm going to keep both hands on the rod. I'm going to lift, and then I'm going to draw that L with the bottom hand. So I'm going to push the bottom hand across to make the rod pull upstream. What I'm doing there is creating slack. You know, that's really the idea, is you've got to create some slack out there, because if you just make your cast and you make a mend and the fly comes under tension, it's not going to do a whole lot of sinking. And making your cast, mend, and drop all the tension out off the fly, now it's going to let that sink tip, and if you have a weighted fly, it's going to let it start digging out there. So when I make this mend, I really want to make sure that my cast comes tight and everything lands in a nice straight line. Anybody who tells you don't have to be a good caster to catch steelhead is just fooling themselves. So I make my cast, I lift, I'm going to pull it back, and now I'm going to drop the tension out of the fly. Now is the sinking time. When I lift my rod tip, I'm going to bring the fly in tension. That's the point where it actually starts fishing. From that point, we can start thinking about the speed of the fly and the tension on the fly using leading and following, everything we talked about with the floating line. Watch that mend one more time. Use both hands. Really, your bottom hand does most of the work. Lift, pull upstream, drop the tension out of it, just to let everything relax out there. If you need to make a second mend, now is the time to do it just before you come into tension. Now you lift the rod tip, and you've got tension on the fly. I like to lift my tip so that I can continue to drop the tip during the swing and continue to relieve the tension on the fly. I think a lot of times guys get lazy. They make their cast, they mend, and they just kind of hold on and pray that the steelhead gods will intervene. Fighting and landing fish is a critical skill as a two-handed angler. Once you've hooked a fish, the first thing through your mind should be to get your rod low and towards the bank. During the fight, there will be times where you'll need to change the angle of the rod, but avoid fighting the fish with the rod straight up in the air. This can oftentimes result in a lost fish. Don't be afraid to fight the fish hard, get them in quick. As the fish tires and it's time to land them, stay in at least knee-deep water. Bringing a thrashing fish into the shallow water is not only dangerous for the fish, but oftentimes leads to losing them. Personally, I like to strip in the last 10 feet of the line during the fight. Once I grab the leader, I can carefully release the loop and take the tension off the rod. That way, I'm not trying to unhook a fish with my rod doubled over. By now, it should be obvious that there's a huge connection between being a proficient caster and an effective angler. Like the pursuit of steelhead, salmon, and trout, being a strong caster takes practice, patience, and persistence. Build your casts on a strong foundation with the fundamentals I've outlined. As you expand your arsenal of casts and excel in technique, integrate the advanced lessons I've discussed. Strive for the ability to cast and fish in any situation regardless of the conditions or tackle requirements. I truly hope this DVD helps you reach new levels in your two-handed casting and fishing. Thank you for supporting the project.